Hello, thank you all so much for being with us today. I am so excited and grateful for my dear friend, the Reverend David W. Peters. What does the W stand for, David? I want to know what the W stands for. Can y'all hear me? Okay. Yeah, I was asking David, what does the W stand for?
William, it just
Okay, thank you.
froze for a second there. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the
Okay,
question. Thank you.
no problem. Okay, so Reverend Peters is an Episcopal priest. He's a U.S. Army veteran and author based in Pflugerville, Texas, which starts with a P, by the way. He's a former Marine and Army chaplain who served in Iraq. He is a teacher and also has planted churches in the Diocese of Texas. And he founded the Episcopal Veterans Fellowship to support healing and community among veterans. He is the author of Death Letter, God, Sex, and War, Post Traumatic God, and Post Traumatic Jesus. And I am so excited to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation, and the time is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Montes. And I'm so glad to be here with you at Union. Uh, the book that was mentioned, Post Traumatic God, is really my doctor of ministry thesis turned into a book. You know, that's kind of the old the old trick. Um, and it centered on the theology and life of Paul Tillich, who was a World War I Army chaplain in the German army during World War I, severely traumatized throughout the war, hospitalized, and then kind of demoted towards the end of the war after getting in a conflict with a general over how to pray about the war. He came home to a shattered marriage. His wife was pregnant with another man's baby, and sort of his life began there. Uh, and then when the Nazis rose to power in the 1930s, he was one of the first non-Jewish professors uh, to lose his job and have his books burned over that controversy. He came to Union Seminary. That was his first landing place in America at around the age 46 or 47, barely speaking intelligible English, and became a professor at Union, where students came to his classes and to um, continue to learn from him. And so my life with coming home from the Iraq War and Paul Tillich's coming home from World War I, both losing wars for our experience, put to paint the broad brush on it, uh, put me in a lot of biographic kinship with him that I felt at that time. And so to be here at Union with you today is truly an honor to follow in his very traumatized footprints in some ways with you today. And I'm thankful for this chapel experience that highlights the experience of very different people from different groups. And I'm thankful for veterans sort of being up today. This is sort of Christmas for veterans during this November. uh, I get invited to a lot of things in November because I'm a veteran, and it's really special. It's cool. Um, because there seems to be like a focus on how do we talk about veterans in a theological context, in a religious context, in a Christian church context, and every religious group has to ask that question. How do we talk about veterans, and how can we understand veterans? So I'll share you my perspective on things. Uh, and for people that study theology and religion, I think we can go maybe a little further into these topics than most general speeches that are given to veterans at parades or community events or civic events can go. We are going into that zone today. So we'll talk about veterans meeting the post-traumatic Jesus. And by that, I mean me meeting the post-traumatic Jesus. I can't speak for all veterans. Veterans come from every walk of life in the United States and certainly around the world. And we all are different. We're different in politics. We're different in religion. We're different in ethnicity and family backgrounds and in human sexuality and every category of human life. Veterans really do represent pretty much every community in America. in surprising ways, even the immigrant community in America is represented strongly in the U.S. military. Um, when I was in Iraq, a couple times a year there, we would go to the big palace, the former palace, where our military headquarters were, and we would have a swearing in ceremony for new American citizens who were serving in the U.S. military over in Iraq, deployed. So that is another aspect of veteran experience that I think a lot of people don't realize in many cases. But I want to start with a quote from my fellow Austinite, Tim O'Brien, author of The Things They Carried, winner of an award for short stories. And I've gotten to meet him once here in Austin, a Vietnam veteran himself. He wrote, "War is hell, but that's not the half of it, because war is also mystery and terror and adventure and courage and discovery and holiness and pity and despair and longing and love. War is nasty. War is fun. War is thrilling. War is drudgery. War makes you a man. War makes you dead." That's from The Things They Carried. Carl Marlantes, another Vietnam veteran, wrote about his time in Vietnam. "Many will argue that there is nothing remotely spiritual in combat. Consider this: mystical or religious experiences have four common components: constant awareness of one's own inevitable death, total focus on the present moment, the valuing of other people's lives above one's own, and being part of a larger religious community, such as a sangha, an ummah, or a church. All four of these exist in combat. The big difference is that the mystic sees heaven and the warrior sees hell. Whether combat is the dark side of the same version or only something equivalent in intensity, I simply don't know. I do know that at the age of 15, I had a mystical experience that scared the hell out of me, and both it and combat in Vietnam put me into a different relationship with the ordinary life and eternity. Most of us, including me, would prefer to think of a sacred space as some light-filled, wondrous place where we can feel good and find a way to shore up our psyches against death. We don't want to think that something as ugly and brutal as combat could be involved in any way with the spiritual. However, would any practicing Christian say that Calvary Hill was not a sacred space?" That's Carl Marlantes and what it is like to go to war. Once we get past some of the practical issues involved, I would like you to consider war as a mystical experience. Traumatic events have this kind of disorienting effect on people. I think we can talk about war the same way we talk about all traumatic events. The only difference between veterans and most people that have traumatic events that have happened to them, and most people have to all kinds of different degrees. Everything I say about trauma or veterans' experiences is pretty much true of anyone who's been through an event that turned your life upside down, not only in the element of horror and the intensity of it, but also in the way it felt, the way we feel like we've lost our sense of identity, our sense of self. Who can we trust anymore? All traumatic events have this sort of world turning upside down effect on people. And so the veteran experience, though, is different in some ways in that, one, everybody kind of knows what it is, and everybody kind of believes you when you say you have it. If you say, "I was in the Vietnam War, I was in World War II," and you say, I have PTSD, people get that pretty quickly of what that means. Now, they might not understand anything more than that about the experience, but that is a believed trauma. Most other traumas in life are not believed. And this is Judith Herman's work on trauma, that the real signature wound for a lot of victims of trauma is that nobody believes them. Certainly victims of sexual assault, sexual violence, and other less public sorts of wounds and traumas have that extra layer of betrayal involved in it. Whereas for most veterans, people do believe us. and give us a certain privilege from that that other trauma victims do not have. And the other is that most veterans have a shared group identity, that the trauma was experienced with other people almost at the same time and in the same kind of way. Uh, the part of military training is to break down your sense of individuality. In Marine Corps basic training that I went through in 19, we were not allowed to use personal pronouns like I or me, or singular pronouns, I guess. We had to say this recruit. We had to refer to ourselves in the third person for about 3 months of that experience. After that, we were allowed to use those. It's funny how policing pronouns is a way to break down people's sense of identity and individuality. The military specializes in that. And so that idea there, the goal is to somehow get a unit to work together and function as one, so you don't feel like, yeah, I'm not doing that. You want me to run out there and rescue that guy who's wounded? I'm not. That looks dangerous. So we do that kind of training to so we don't have that sense of individual safety and self-preservation, and that has a overall use in that way, but it does erode the sense of self. And I got thinking about boot camp there, and I kind of lost my train of thought. But in that we mentality, the trauma is shared by people, and that is another distinctive, maybe a veteran's experience then of many other trauma victims in this country and in the world. But I do think it is a shared mystical experience, as all traumatic events are. Um, when people experience traumatic events, whether it's a robbery or other car crashes or just things that do happen in ordinary life, not very often, hopefully, but often enough that many people have experienced them, people will describe them as surreal, in surreal terms. Um, and I remember hearing this as a young man in the events surrounding 9/11, that people described the surreal nature of what they saw and what they experienced. Uh, Traumatic events break us loose from ordinary reality, and they do have a profound effect on our theology. In other words, what we believe about God, what we believe about ourselves, our own identity, and what or who God is. They always say there's no atheists in foxholes, but there are. There's every kind of believer and non-believer in foxholes, um, in war and in peace. But I became a mystic in war, in that upside down universe, the upside down moral universe of war. There's a difference between post-traumatic stress disorder and moral injury. Dr. Serene Jones, who you know well, has done amazing work on trauma and theology, and I've really benefited and learned from her work on PTSD, especially in describing how that happens to people in one of the most non-shame based ways I've ever heard it described. I got to hear her at a conference last fall or last spring, and just hearing her describe PTSD and how people get that was so healing just for me, um, to hear it in a way that didn't have that same element that I often feel of shame for being like not perfect or not good or not able to handle certain things. A lot of people know what PTSD is, a medical diagnosis from the DSM-5, and you can be diagnosed with it by a healthcare professional. It does have spiritual implications that the church and religious groups should be talking about and learning about. But there's this other thing called moral injury that I think better describes the veteran experience for a lot of people. And they can come and go together. They don't always have to be one or the other at all. Moral injury, if PTSD comes from being the prey, something or someone is hunting you, something is trying to hurt you, destroy you, kill you, harm you, and does or attempts to, or the threat of that exists, people get PTSD from that. A lot of people get PTSD from from military service, from war, but also from all the other harm that is done to people on this planet, which It's 2025, and you'd think humans would have progressed far enough to not do bad stuff to each other, but we haven't. And that's putting it rather comically, but it's not funny. It's not comic. It's actually the tragedy of human life. People understand PTSD in that way, whereas moral injury is more about being the predator. It is about causing harm to people, to human beings, whether by threat or by actually doing harm to people. In a military context, that is often the job of military service, is to cause harm to people. As the Episcopalian general George Patton said, you don't win wars by dying for your country. You get wars by getting somebody else to die for their country. That's kind of how you win. Causing harm to other humans is the job of war, job of the soldier. Now that should be done proportionately and all those other things that ethicists and talk about. At the same time, that is often not what happens. There's always a disproportionate way that violence is meted out in when it's used in almost any context. There's also the failure to help people that causes this moral injury, the failure to help people that are in need. Certainly, in a war, there are people that have severe needs, both refugees, people that are displaced, people that are suffering, and the military member or service member cannot always help them. Certainly, medical professionals have this in triage situations where there's people coming in with severe medical needs and they have to decide who to help first and who to help second, who to help third. And so medical professionals usually understand this pretty well. The sense of moral injury is that I'm not good anymore. I have done things to cause harm to other people. So I no longer deserve to be part of the community the way that I was before. And that sense of moral injury is threaded through the veteran experience on so many levels. It comes out in weird ways. It comes out in our t-shirts that we buy that say like, stay back 50 feet or I'll shoot you, almost as a comic kind of, joke, but it's not funny. And it's actually really a kind of morbid humor that often comes in communities that have a lot of moral injury in them. So predator and prey, prey and predator, this distinction between PTSD and moral injuries helped me understand my own experience. There's another word for moral injury in English that is an archaic English word that nobody uses anymore, except in context of dessert or chocolate. The word is sin. It's not a word you'll hear in most conversations about normal things in the world, unless it's a very specific religious context. People will use the sin word, but in most secular society and the society that we all work and live in, I mean, I work at a middle school. That does have a lot of sin in it, in the sense of harm being done to others, both verbally and physically at times. And yeah, I've never heard the word sin used in any disciplinary context in that middle school, because that's not how we talk about these kinds of things. The churches in Christian groups and religious groups often do still talk about some concept of sin, that something inside us, or wherever it comes from, that causes harm to others, that we have to do something about, that we have to cleanse in some way or heal in some way or get rid of in some way. Every religious group that I've ever learned about as an outsider, or certainly my own tradition as a Christian, has a way to deal with this. Even different Christian groups have different ways to deal with sin and moral injury. When I was a Baptist in West Virginia many years ago, we would have altar calls where if you weren't like getting saved for the first time, you were to go up and confess your sins and give your life to God again. And, if enough people didn't do it, the service would go a lot longer. So some of us would just go up to, move things along. But also I had profound moments of giving some of my sins to God at that altar there in West Virginia. Different groups have different ways to do this. Pentecostal Christians might have laying on of hands, anointing with oil. Episcopalian Christians have healing services and the rite of sacrament of confession. Catholics probably are most famous for their rites of confession and absolution. But every religious group has, I think, or at least Christian group, has a way to do this, to get rid of something that you're carrying. And that is a place that religious groups should be engaging with veterans on, but in a way that doesn't lead with that, perhaps, because there is so much shame in most veterans' wartime experience. And that's the thing I didn't quite understand when I came back from Iraq, that the stories I was telling about my experience there, because everybody wanted to know. I got back in like 2007. So that was right when the situation in Baghdad was turning from sort of a conquest of Saddam's regime to a civil war to a situation of grave instability and unrest and quagmire, and all these words like Vietnam were being used by the American military and by the American public. And so people wanted to know what it was like there, and I would start to talk about it, about my little experience there. And I found that the stuff I was saying wasn't capturing what I felt about it, because we know polite answers and we know how to talk about things in ways that people kind of want to hear. But then there's this deeper part of us that says, there's something wrong here, and I don't know how to say it. And I realized that a lot of what I wanted to tell people were stories of failure and shame and ways in which I wish I had done better in my limited scope of what I did as a chaplain over there. So these shame stories have to be cared for the way we care for any kind of shame story. But here at Union, I think about Paul Tillich coming back from World War I a lot. He did say his probably most famous quote, and I don't know how you guys think about Paul Tillich, since you're right there on the campus and around the school. You probably have a lot of different thoughts and views of him, or maybe not at all. I don't know. I'm always curious how people inside an organization see someone that people outside know about. But his most famous quote, and you probably have T-shirts in the bookstore with this one on it. I don't know. It says, "The courage to be is found in the God who appears when God disappears in the anxiety of doubt and fear. The courage to be is found in the God who appears when God disappears in the anxiety of doubt and fear." And there is a lot of time in between God disappearing and then reappearing. That can be a long time for people who have been through traumatic events. It can be years, decades, a lifetime, or it can be a much shorter time. It's different for everybody. But the way he said it there, I think, captures some of that feeling. And his writings helped me a lot when I was coming back from war. As I started to think about how his theology and his beliefs and the things he said about God, they were hugely controversial in his day and are even controversial in our day. How might that help me personally? And maybe other people have had experiences like mine in war and other traumatic events. I think in three ways, his main views that I kind of gleaned from his writings help me. One is that his belief in the ground of being, talking about God as the ground of being, uh, certainly had an appeal to a more secular America, a more secular world that wasn't so steeped in religion as it had been previously. And we say that every year as Americans, like, America's less religious. We wake up and say, hey, we're less religious. And yet, here we are doing this. And lots of people are in their own way. Things shift and change, but he certainly was feeling that. This idea of God as a ground of being rather than a personal or more personal person that you can talk to and has like a plan for your life and is sculpting and scripting your life. I think when people go through traumatic events, certainly when I was in Baghdad, I felt, how in the world could a God with power allow this? And that's sort of a basic thought of awakening that a lot of people have that grow up religious. We believe in a kind of Santa Claus God. If you're good, if you behave, if you do the kind of things we tell young people to do, you'll have a good life. And if you don't behave and you don't do good things, you'll have a bad life and bad things will happen to you. And the reality is, you can have the best life ever and do everything right, and you'll still have bad things happen to you. things that turn our worlds completely upside down. And for me, I think that was the Iraq War and my experience of homecoming, feeling like I had done something that I thought was good and right in the sense of the Army needed chaplains. And I was like, well, I can do this job and I need to go with these soldiers who are doing it as a generally good thing. Why did my life become so difficult? Why did I feel this sense of shame and failure in a way that was overwhelming? Um, whose side is God on in a war? Is the maybe a very sophomore question. Whose side is God on a football game? Whose side is God on in any kind of human conflict? That's a simple question with a difficult answer. Um, certainly, um, the one about suffering. Why is there suffering if God's powerful? Why did my friend die when I felt like I should have died? If anybody should have died, why can't I seem to live normally? And when I think I did what God wanted me to, these are like sort of basic theological questions that you only come to when you confront the suffering in your own life or in the life of people you're close to, or even in a situation you can't escape from. And so this idea of God as the ground of being helped me a lot. That God is not up there in the sky as much as God is in the dirt of my experience. Paul Tillich dug his own friend's grave there in the shallow trenches of World War One. His best friend, he buried and couldn't read the service over him as he was the unit chaplain, but he couldn't do it. He just stood there silently in the mud. And that in that ground of our experience, the dirt, the muck, the mire, and the dust of our experience, and the dust that we are made of ultimately, that God fashioned us in his own image from that dust. That is the place where God is. And that really helped me as someone that was trying to figure out what God was or who God was. Certainly, God is a man up in the sky that sort of orchestrated everything. That idea died a hard death in Iraq and in the homecoming experience. I think for a lot of veterans, you'll find that this varies. Some people become more assertive in their faith, some people become less, but everybody changes in some ways through most traumatic experiences. I know this is an academic environment, so I can't say absolutely or every time or it's always like this because there's a million exceptions. But I've found this to be true in my community of veterans. Tillich, I don't know if you know about Karl Barth. Do you ever talk about him in seminary these days? I know it's ancient history, but he was probably the big theologian that stood up against Nazism there from his safe reserve in Switzerland in many ways. He's the one that sent Dietrich Bonhoeffer back to his homeland of Germany to resist the Nazis. And Karl Barth was a critic of Paul Tillich in many ways, but he did so from a very respectful distance and scholarly interest. He did say that Tillich was still fighting the Grand Inquisitor. And I found that note to be very strange to me, that Tillich had something that really always ate at him, a shame experience of some kind. I think it was this combat trauma that followed him, the first, last, and only turning point of his life, as his biographer said. The second is the new being that Tillich quotes Galatians, that in Christ there is neither circumcision or uncircumcision. Not a topic that is a lot of fun to talk about in any context, let alone a chapel. But what he was writing about, what he said, St. Paul was talking about there. Paul Tillich said St. Paul. It's going to get confusing here. Was that neither religion or anti-religion was the answer to the human crisis. Being hyper-religious, so religious that you don't really care about anything else, and being so anti-religious that you can't go near any of it, are both responses that are often unhelpful in life and not very healthy. But Jesus, for Paul Tillich, in this new being, offered this way of being in community with other people that was not bound by either religion or anti-religion. And he got that from the book of Galatians, which is a weird book to dealing with that topic of circumcision in many ways for Christians. But I found that to be helpful because I had to find completely new friends, a completely new community after my wartime experience. Um, and that I found that to be so disorienting, to not feel like I was part of things anymore. And reforging that, reforming that is what a lot of traumatized people have to do. And lastly, there, um, this idea of, well, actually, I already covered all three. The courage to be was the one, and then the grounded being, and then lastly was uh, the concept of the new being. Those things really helped me kind of move and stay Christian after my experience in the Iraq War. And then years later, I started to think about Jesus again and how Jesus, um, for me, presents himself in the Gospels, and how the writers of the Gospels, whoever they were able to kind of talk about him in a post-traumatic lens or through a post-traumatic lens. The writers of the New Testament are writing from a post-traumatic lens as they reflect on the death of their teacher and who they believe to be God. That experience of reading the Gospels through a post-traumatic lens was something I was already doing because I was discarding parts that didn't make any sense to me through my lens of trauma, and I was latching on to other ones that were really helping me. And so this post-traumatic Jesus that I met with his 5 visible wounds um, told me that there might be wounds that were invisible as well, that these wounds that he presents himself with to the disciples after the resurrection in several gospel accounts, the wounds that Thomas says, I want to put my finger into, and the word that Thomas uses there for uh, for the wound part, it's usually like put your fingers through my hands, through in my side, but then he uses a word type or tupon in Greek, the type or the imprint of the hand. He says, I want to put my finger through the imprint of his hand. And I got to thinking about it. It's not a normal word to use for wound in the Bible, in the Greek language. There's other words for every language has a lot of words for wounds because it happens a lot. And Greek has a lot of words for wound, and that's not that typical of a word for wound. This idea that it's some like form or indentation in his body, that it's not quite a scar, because I've got a few scars and you probably do too. You can't like put your finger in them. Now, maybe the wounds are so fresh from the crucifixion that that's how he's thinking about them, that they still are kind of open and he could put his hand and finger. This is kind of gross, I know. But this is where like the church has kind of always gone with these kind of wounds. And especially people that have suffered traumatic events and been exposed to a lot of other people's wounds have always been curious about these wounds, and especially these invisible wounds. What are the invisible wounds of war? What are the invisible wounds of crucifixion? These are the kind of things that make life difficult. These are the kind of wounds to our trust, our sense of self, our sense of identity, and who we are in the world. And I do think that the post traumatic Jesus does offer a message to veterans that, one, there are these very outward physical manifestations of wounds that are serious. I used to work on an amputee ward, probably the most visible signature wound of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars in America. Um, and so these are very obvious, visible wounds, but everyone there had wounds that were much deeper and less visible, that were the ones that made their lives really, really, really difficult. Um, and that's true of everyone who's been through these experiences. I want to end with a reflection on the wounds of Jesus from the Gospel of John and then Matthew. John writes about the wound in Jesus' side. He says when the spear pierced his side, but one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, that you may also believe. This is right from the Gospel of John. Sort of at the end of the Gospel, we have this crucifixion scene that John paints for us in a very mystical way. John is a mystic, writing mystically about the life of Jesus. So he's going to write about it a little different way than the other three Gospels. And he says, I saw this wound go in, which is a horrific event to see someone you love. Um, hurt in this way. I can't imagine what that would be like. It's probably better not to imagine it too much. But he says blood and water come out. This surreal quality of this event is very much manifest in his writing. And then he says, I really saw it. You got to believe me. I'm not making this up. Like, he doubles down on the fact that you're going to doubt what he's saying as being true. You didn't see that, John. Because probably people said, you didn't see that. But he's talking about the surreal nature of trauma, the wounds that he saw inflicted on Jesus changed the way he saw everything, the way he saw reality. And so he does it again in First John, if it's the same author. You can talk to the biblical studies department about whether this is the same author or not. But that's sort of the traditional view. He says again, the spirit and the water and the blood bear witness to this wound of blood and water coming from Jesus' side. And he kind of like has to convince you again that he really saw it. Very few other events in the Bible are written like this. But the fact that it's a severe trauma means that you're probably going to wonder if people are really believing you. The church is a place, and I think religious groups in general are places of belief. We are places that believe things. We believe things about God. We believe things about humanity. We believe things about the world. And we say sometimes that we believe stuff, like with creeds. That's what creed means. I believe. And yet we have a hard time believing people often. We have a hard time believing people that the wounds and things they experienced were real, really happened to them, and that they had the kind of effect on them that is making life difficult, burdensome, harsh, and even short. So John's gospel kind of shows us this post-traumatic Jesus in a very vivid way. And the fact that the way we see him is going to be filtered through the lens that we see him. And then we come to Matthew's account of Jesus's crucifixion. And Matthew has a lot of details about who was there and who wasn't there and who did what, when, and what Jesus said. I think the words from the cross come from Matthew's gospel of, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus quoting this psalm that he would have known his whole life from the cross. And then the earthquake that happens, the tombs are open. And then he's like, a bunch of people were walking around and stuff in Jerusalem. What that's about, people have been wondering for 2,000 years. Maybe you have a theory on what was going on there. But then he goes to the centurion, who is a Roman soldier, who is someone that got his job by being a good Roman soldier, which means a lot of different things in the first century. But it means someone that is trusted by the Roman army, someone that is a position of leadership over 80 to 100 soldiers. And he is in charge of the crucifixion. He is in charge of it. In other words, he is the one that is actually doing the order that Pilate gives to crucify Jesus. He is implementing this order. He is the one that is bearing the burden of moral injury more than anyone else in the story. He has been told by his superiors to do this. And he does it because he's probably done it before, and he knows how to do it, and he gets the soldiers to do it. And yet he has this profound spiritual, mystical experience while he sees Jesus die. Something about his death, and maybe the earthquake and all the other stuff, changes his mind and convinces him of something that he didn't believe before. He says his final words, and the way the whole story of the crucifixion closes from Matthew, this is the height of the drama. He says, truly, this man was the Son of God. And so I offer you today that veterans have had some kind of profound mystical experience that we as religious people and leaders and students of religion can try to draw out of them to help them better integrate with the world as it is, that we all have to do after trauma, and also to help with that healing process. I want to offer two prayers as we close, or one prayer, a healing prayer. And I prayed this for the veterans at the church I was at Sunday. To me, this is where healing starts. It starts when we recognize that the person that went to war was a child, and we didn't really know what we were getting into fully. Jesus says from his cross to the soldiers who are crucifying him, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And yet it does seem like they know what they're doing. And yet we have this paradox even in that story. Lord Jesus Christ, good shepherd of the sheep, you gather the lambs in your arms and carry them in your bosom. We commend to your loving care all the veterans and all the people who have been through traumatic events. Relieve their pain, guard us from all danger, restore to us your gifts of gladness and strength, and raise us up to a life of service to you and to others. Hear us, we pray, for your dear name's sake. Amen. And I'll conclude there. If anyone has any questions or thoughts, I'd love to hear those.
Sorry, we couldn't unmute ourselves. And I'm no longer the host, so I couldn't do it. Thank you so much for this. This was just eye-opening for me. It was very moving. It was just thank you so much. If there's anybody who would like to ask a question or make a comment, I ask for the host to please let us unmute. And if not, I just really want to thank you. And I would love to ask you to just send me something in writing because I really want to, I took some notes, but I want to see like your 3 points and the wounds. I mean the invisible wounds. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for being so caring and so gentle about all of us. Like you said, all of us have gone through some kind of trauma. And yeah, so thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Thank you all. Yeah.
Yes, Avinash.
Thank you, Father, for having a profound uh, talk on trauma, especially the point which I don't have questions, but I have a compliment or comment to what you said that normally people don't realize. As when I say people, that represent people those who don't think about traumas in the way you explained. But the thing which really touched me is that moral injury, which causes a lot harm to people, knowingly, unknowingly. A lot of people don't address moral injuries, but you have drawn our ideas and thoughts also to think on this way that moral injury has a lot to do with the destruction of total personality of a human being. Thank you so much for bringing this up.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't have a way to do that in modern American culture. We have, we never want to see you again ever. That's like, we might call that cancel culture, where you never ever see that person ever again appear anywhere, ever, no matter what. Or nothing ever happens to them. And we don't have anything in between those two extremes, really, for our public figures in America, whether pop stars, politicians, or anyone who does harm to others. And I think religious groups do have a way of doing this. And we've often lost that ability to restore people after they've done things that have violated the community's conscience and their own.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you all.
You
Thank
can
you
get
all.
us off the YouTube and thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you so much. Really
And God
excited.
bless you all in your studies.
Thank you. Definitely need them.